There is a building in Armenia that has been used for Christian worship continuously since the 4th century AD. Not restored, not reconstructed in the manner of a historic site, not a monument that holds services on special occasions to honor its heritage. A cathedral that has been the center of an entire national church for 1700 years, through invasions, through occupations, through genocide, through Soviet atheism, through the fall of empires and the rise of others. And that is still functioning today as the spiritual headquarters of the Armenian Apostolic Church and all its congregations around the world. Most people who know anything about early Christianity can tell you about Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch. The great centers, the councils, the schisms, the long theological arguments about the nature of Christ that split the ancient Christian world into factions that still exist today. What most of those same people cannot tell you is that there was a fifth center, older than Constantinople, older than Rome as a Christian capital, the first nation in history to adopt Christianity as a state religion, and that its mother church is still standing in the Armenian town of Vargashapat, which the world knows as ETCHMIADZIN. And the reason most people cannot tell you that is not because the evidence is obscure. It is because the story of Armenia and its church has been buried under everything that happened to the Armenian people in the centuries that followed. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are right now. I find it genuinely interesting who ends up finding stories like this one. Armenia sits at a crossroads that has never been comfortable. The Armenian Plateau, a high volcanic tableland in the South Caucasus, bordered by the Black Sea to the west, the Caspian to the east, and the mountains of the Caucasus to the north, has been at the intersection of competing empires for as long as anyone has been writing history. The Persians came through here. Alexander came through here. The Romans and the Parthians fought over it for centuries, using Armenia as a buffer state and a prize simultaneously. Later came the Byzantines and the Sassanids, then the Arabs, then the Mongols, then the Ottomans and the Safavids. What is remarkable about the Armenian people in this context is not that they survived, though survival under these conditions was genuinely not guaranteed. What is remarkable is that they developed, in the midst of this perpetual geopolitical pressure, one of the most distinctively autonomous cultural and religious identities in the ancient world, a unique alphabet, invented in the early 5th century specifically to translate the Bible and other Christian texts into Armenian, a theological tradition that diverged from both Rome and Constantinople at the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD, and that has maintained its specific theological position ever since. And a physical anchor for all of this, the cathedral at ETCHMIADZIN, which was there before the alphabet, before the Chalcedon split, before any of the empires that would spend the following centuries trying to reshape or destroy what Armenia was. The story of ETCHMIADZIN begins with a man named Gregory, who was not Armenian. He was Parthian by origin, from a noble family. The specific details of his background are preserved in Armenian sources and in Agathangelos, a 5th century historian whose account of the period is the primary source for this story, though scholars debate how much of Agathangelos is history and how much is hagiography. What Gregory wanted, as best we can tell from the sources, was to serve the God he had been raised to believe in a world where that belief had already cost him a great deal. What he feared probably was more of the same. He had been imprisoned for roughly 13 years by the time the story reaches its turning point. 13 years in a pit. In the Armenian sources, the pit is described in terms that are supposed to convey despair and isolation. He survived. He survived long enough to become the person who changed the course of his civilization. The king who imprisoned Gregory was a man named Tiridates III. Tiridates was a complex figure, a warrior king, aggressive and effective in the way that warrior kings tend to be effective, deeply committed to the traditional Zoroastrian and polytheistic religious world of the Armenian aristocracy. He imprisoned Gregory because Gregory refused to participate in a pagan religious ceremony at the temple of the goddess Anahit. This refusal was a political act as much as a religious one. The temple of Anahit was a center of Armenian royal legitimacy, and refusing to honor it was a kind of challenge to the authority structure that Tiridates represented. Tiridates put Gregory in the pit. The sources say that Tiridates later went mad. Whether this was actual mental illness, a political crisis that manifested in erratic behavior, or a symbolic narrative constructed after the fact to explain what came next, is something historians continue to debate. What the sources agree on is that Gregory was released from the pit after 13 years. He was brought out, and that he healed the king, and that the king converted to Christianity, and that in 301 AD, Armenia became the first nation in history to officially adopt Christianity as its state religion. 301 AD. To put that in context, the Emperor Constantine did not issue the Edict of Milan, which made Christianity legal in the Roman Empire, until 313 AD. Armenia was officially Christian 12 years before Christianity was even legal in Rome. Now here is the part that tends to get left out when this story is told quickly. Gregory did not just heal a king and produce a political conversion. According to the Armenian sources, he had a vision. He saw Jesus Christ descend from heaven, strike the earth with a golden hammer, and mark the spot where a church should be built. That spot, the spot marked in the vision, became the site of the cathedral at ETCHMIADZIN. The name ETCHMIADZIN means roughly the place where the only begotten descended. The church was named for the vision that located it. I want to be careful here about the difference between what this means theologically to the Armenian church and what it means historically. To the Armenian Apostolic Church, the vision of Gregory is a founding miracle, the literal descent of Christ, marking the literal site of the mother church of the Armenian nation. This is the church's self-understanding, and it is not an abstract claim. The church is built on that site. The altar is at the point where Christ was seen to strike the earth. To the historian, the vision is evidence of the specific theological seriousness with which the Armenians understood their conversion, not as a political convenience or a royal decree that trickled down to a grudging population, but as a direct divine mandate located in a specific place, given to a specific man, producing a specific building that has been in that specific place for 17 centuries. Both of these things can be true simultaneously. The historian's reading does not cancel the theological reading. What it does is explain why the site matters in a way that goes beyond the merely historical. ETCHMIADZIN is not simply old. It is understood by Armenian Christians as the point where the divine literally touched the earth of their nation. That is why the cathedral endures when everything else around it was repeatedly destroyed or appropriated. The original cathedral was modest. 4th century Armenian construction was working with the materials and methods of the late antique world, and the first church at ETCHMIADZIN was a relatively simple structure by the standards of what would come later. What it had was location and meaning. Over the following centuries, the church was rebuilt, expanded, and modified repeatedly by different kings, different Catholicoi, the title of the head of the Armenian church, different architectural traditions. The dome, that is now the cathedral's most distinctive feature, was added in the 5th century. The bell tower was added much later. The frescoes inside date from the 17th and 18th centuries, painted over and around the older architectural fabric. This layered quality, something that photographs of ETCHMIADZIN do not always convey, but that you feel immediately when you understand the building's history. The cathedral is not one building from one period. It is 17 centuries of continuous religious use, each century leaving its specific mark on the structure, some additions graceful, some awkward, some later removed, some still present. The accumulated evidence of a community that has been maintaining this space since the 4th century. and has made it look different in each century while keeping it fundamentally itself. The 4th century core is still there. Archaeologists have identified the original structure beneath the later additions. The altar stands at the point where the tradition says Gregory's vision located it. The building has changed. The location has not moved. The caliphate of all Armenians is based at ETCHMIADZIN. This means the spiritual authority over Armenian Apostolic Christians worldwide, an estimated 12 million people across the global Armenian diaspora, is exercised from this compound in a town of roughly 50,000 people in modern Armenia. Let me sit with the diaspora for a moment, because it is inseparable from the story of ETCHMIADZIN. The Armenian genocide of 1915 and the following years killed between 600,000 and 1.5 million people. The exact number is debated, partly because the political implications of the debate are enormous, and partly because precise documentation of a mass murder is inherently incomplete. It destroyed the Armenian communities that had existed for millennia in Anatolia. It scattered the survivors across the world, to Syria, to Lebanon, to France, to the United States, to Argentina, to wherever they could reach. The Armenian diaspora communities that formed in the aftermath of the genocide took with them the church. In Los Angeles, in Paris, in Beirut, in Buenos Aires, in Sydney. Wherever Armenians went, they built churches in the architectural tradition of ETCHMIADZIN, conducted liturgies in Grabar, the ancient Armenian language of the church, and maintained a living connection to a homeland that many of them would never see again. For these communities, ETCHMIADZIN is not simply a historical monument or even primarily a religious headquarters. It is the physical proof that something survived. The church was there before the Ottoman Empire existed. It was there during the genocide. It is still there. This specific continuity, the building still standing at the place where the vision located it, the liturgy still being conducted in the ancient language, the Catholicos still residing in the compound, is a form of evidence that matters to a people whose entire physical world in Anatolia was destroyed. And then there was the Soviet period, which added another layer to what ETCHMIADZIN had already survived. When the Soviet Union incorporated Armenia in 1920, it brought with it the official Marxist-Leninist position on religion, which was that it was a bourgeois ideological construct, an opium of the people in Lenin's formulation, to be systematically reduced and eventually eliminated as society advanced toward communism. Churches were closed, clergy were arrested, religious education was banned. The public practice of faith was discouraged with degrees of coercion that varied depending on the political climate of the moment. And yet ETCHMIADZIN was not closed. The Soviet government made a pragmatic calculation about the Armenian church that it did not always make about other religious institutions. The Armenian Apostolic Church was a significant force in the Armenian diaspora. The diaspora communities that had formed after the genocide were concentrated in Western countries and represented both political influence and financial resources that the Soviet state found useful to maintain access to. Allowing ETCHMIADZIN to function as the nominal headquarters of a worldwide church gave the Soviet government a lever for engaging with diaspora Armenian communities, even as it restricted the church's actual influence within Soviet Armenia itself. The Catholicos during the most intense period of Soviet rule, a man named Georg VI, who served from 1945 to 1954, navigated this situation with a combination of strategic accommodation and quiet resistance that is characteristic of religious leaders operating under authoritarian systems. He maintained the institutional structure of the church. He kept the seminary running at reduced capacity. He preserved what could be preserved. Was he right to accommodate? That question has been debated within the Armenian church ever since, and the debate is still not fully resolved. The people who argue for accommodation say that the alternative, resistance that would have resulted in the closure of the church entirely, was worse. The people who argue against say that the accommodations gave the Soviet state a degree of legitimacy and cover that it did not deserve. Both arguments are made in good faith by people who care deeply about what the church represents. The specific dilemma of how to protect a sacred institution under a hostile secular government is not one that has a clean answer, and the fact that ETCHMIADZIN survived the Soviet period, damaged but intact, diminished but not destroyed, does not settle the question of whether the price paid was the right price. The treasury at ETCHMIADZIN contains relics that the Armenian church considers among the most sacred objects in Christianity. The spear of Longinus, the lance that, according to the Gospel of John, was used to pierce the side of Christ at the crucifixion, is kept at ETCHMIADZIN. The Armenian tradition holds that the disciple Thaddeus brought the spear to Armenia in the 1st century. It is called the Geghard, the Armenian word for spear, and the name has traveled far enough that one of Armenia's most beautiful medieval monasteries, carved into a cliff face in a river gorge east of Yerevan, is called Geghard Monastery after the tradition of the spear's presence there. The treasury also contains what is said to be a fragment of the wood of Noah's Ark, preserved from a piece brought down from Mount Ararat, the mountain that is visible from the cathedral on a clear day, sitting on the Turkish side of the border that was drawn after the genocide reshaped the region's political geography. The right hand of Gregory himself, the man who converted the nation and located the church, is also in the treasury, preserved as a relic used in the ceremonial consecration of each new Catholicos. The historical verifiability of these relics is a separate question from their meaning. The fragment of Noah's Ark cannot be dated to the Bronze Age by any physical method. The spear of Longinus, if it is the same object that struck the body of Christ, would be approximately 2,000 years old. Possible in physical terms, but impossible to verify in historical terms. The hand of Gregory, if authentic, dates from the early 4th century, which is plausible but also unverifiable. What these relics mean to the church is not primarily evidential. They are material connections to the founding stories of Christianity and of the Armenian church specifically. They are physical objects that make those stories present in the specific room where the liturgy is conducted. For a community that lost almost everything in the 20th century, the relics in the ETCHMIADZIN treasury are not primarily historical curiosities. They are the surviving material substance of a tradition that was targeted for destruction and survived. The Armenian liturgical tradition is one of the oldest in the world, and it is one of the least well-known outside the Armenian community itself. The Divine Liturgy of the Armenian Apostolic Church is conducted in Grabar, Classical Armenian, the language of the 5th century translation of the Bible that was one of the founding acts of Armenian Christian culture. Grabar is not a spoken vernacular today. It has not been the spoken language of ordinary life for many centuries. It is maintained as a liturgical language the way Latin was maintained in the Catholic Church, as a sacred register of language, unchanged across the centuries, connecting the present congregation to every congregation that has used this language in this tradition since the 5th century. The Armenian church music tradition, the sharakan, the hymn form that was developed in medieval Armenia, is among the most distinctive sacred music traditions in the world. The scales and modes used in Armenian church music do not correspond to the Western European musical tradition. They have their own specific emotional and theological logic, developed over centuries by composers whose names are known and whose work has been continuously performed since the medieval period. Standing in ETCHMIADZIN during a full liturgy, the ancient language, the specific music, the smell of incense that has been burned in this space for 17 centuries, is an experience that people who have had it tend to describe with a specific quality of temporal disorientation. The liturgy is conducting in the present tense, in the present moment, in a building that looks like the present century in some of its frescoes, and like the 4th century in its oldest stone. The effect is of being inside a long continuity rather than inside a specific moment. ETCHMIADZIN was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2000. This formal international recognition did two things simultaneously. It placed the cathedral in the global heritage conversation on the terms that UNESCO uses: archaeological significance, architectural integrity, historical authenticity, and it translated something that had been primarily a confessional and ethnic heritage into a universal human heritage. The translation is not complete and probably cannot be complete. ETCHMIADZIN means something different to an Armenian Orthodox Christian than it means to a heritage tourist from a different tradition. The cathedral is not equally all things to all people who visit it, but the UNESCO inscription acknowledges that what is preserved here has a significance that extends beyond the community that built and maintained it, that the survival of a 4th century Christian building in continuous use is a fact about human history broadly, not only about Armenian history specifically. What the inscription cannot do is undo the specific losses that make ETCHMIADZIN's survival so charged. The Armenian churches of Anatolia, the hundreds of churches in the territory that is now Turkey, many of them ancient, many of them architecturally significant, built in the same tradition as ETCHMIADZIN, were destroyed or converted or abandoned in the aftermath of the genocide. The physical religious landscape of the Armenian world in Anatolia is mostly gone. What remained was in the Republic of Armenia. What remained included ETCHMIADZIN. The cathedral's survival is not simply a fact about good fortune or durable stone. It is a fact about what was and was not destroyed in the processes that shaped the 20th century. And understanding what was destroyed and why is inseparable from understanding why the survival of what was not destroyed carries the specific weight that it carries. On a clear day, you can see Mount Ararat from the cathedral at ETCHMIADZIN. Ararat is the mountain that the book of Genesis identifies as the resting place of Noah's Ark. It is the national symbol of Armenia. It is on the Armenian coat of arms. It is the mountain that Armenians have called their mountain for as long as they have been calling themselves Armenians. It is on the Turkish side of the border. The mountain was on the Armenian side of the border before the genocide and the political reorganization that followed it. It is not there now. The border was drawn after the events that drove the Armenian population from Anatolia, and Ararat ended up in Turkish territory, where it has remained. The Armenians at ETCHMIADZIN can see their sacred mountain from the compound of their mother church. They cannot stand on it. They can look at it, and they can conduct their liturgy under its presence in the distant sky. And that specific combination, the mountain visible but unreachable, the church standing in a diminished homeland, the diaspora scattered across the world but connected to this specific building, is one of the more quietly devastating geopolitical facts in the modern world. ETCHMIADZIN today receives hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. Some are tourists. Many are Armenian pilgrims from the diaspora, people from the Armenian communities of Los Angeles and Paris and Beirut and Sao Paulo, coming to stand in the building that their great-grandparents' grandparents stood in, conducting a liturgy in a language that has not changed since the 5th century, in a building whose core has not moved since the 4th. For the pilgrims from the diaspora, the visit is often described as something that goes beyond religious obligation. It is described as a return. The word is complicated because for many of them, it is the first time. Their families never lived in this specific town. The Armenian world they are descended from was in Anatolia, not in what is now the Republic of Armenia. The return is to something symbolic as much as geographic, to the mother church, to the specific continuity, to the evidence that the tradition survived. What does it mean to return to a place you have never been, but that has always been, in some sense, the center of who you are? That is not a question I can answer from the outside. I am not Armenian. I do not carry that specific history. But I can tell you that the answer to it Whatever shape it takes for the specific person standing in that specific cathedral is not primarily about architecture or history or UNESCO classifications. It is about what survives when almost everything else is taken. And it is about what that survival demands of the people who receive it. Here is the question I keep sitting with after spending time with this story. ETCHMIADZIN survived because it was in what became Soviet Armenia rather than in Ottoman Anatolia. That specific geographic luck, the fact that the border between the Ottoman and Russian empires ran in a specific place, leaving this specific building on the Russian side, is what preserved it when the rest of the Armenian Christian landscape of the region was being destroyed. There was nothing special about the stone at ETCHMIADZIN that made it more durable than the stone of the hundreds of Armenian churches in Anatolia that no longer stand. There was no particular theological virtue in this building that protected it when the others were converted to mosques or stables or simply demolished. What protected it was a border, a political line drawn on a map, the specific accident of geography that put this building on the side that survived. And yet the people who maintain this building do not experience it as a lucky accident. They experience it as the place where God marked the earth with a golden hammer and told a man to build a church. The theological and the historical are not the same story, but they are stories about the same building. And the building is still standing. What do you do with that? With the knowledge that the most sacred place in your tradition survived not because of its sacred character, but because of where the Russians and the Ottomans drew a line in the 19th century. And what does it say about the nature of sacred places that this fact, this cold geopolitical fact, does not diminish the cathedral at all? That the liturgy is still as old, and the stone is still as ancient, and the Catholicos still receives his office from the right hand of Gregory, and the mountain is still visible on a clear day. I do not have a clean answer to any of that. I am not sure one exists. What do you make of all this? Leave your thoughts below. I read every comment. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and come back.